Hey guys, Logan here from Popular Woodworking Magazine. You know, one of the things I really enjoy about working with the magazine is I get to introduce a lot of new woodworkers to this hobby, and I get to field a lot of questions that they have. And one of the questions I get a lot is about glues in the shop, what glue I use and what I suggest. And that's an answer with two different parts. For standard woodworking projects, I use a PVA glue, kind of your standard Titebond Original or Titebond 2. But I also have a good set of epoxy in my shop. This one's the West System epoxy, and it has some very real and practical applications in the shop, and I want to walk you through those today and how I use epoxy in my shop and where I think it makes sense. So the most commonly used application of epoxy in my shop is when I have a big complex glue up. Now with a standard PVA glue, you may only have 10 or 15 minutes before that glue starts to cure. And if you have a lot of parts that have to come together all at once, you can really be up against the clock to get those together before stuff starts seizing and you're just kind of stuck. Depending on which hardener you use, now epoxy is made of a resin and a hardener, and you can mix and match different hardeners with your resin, so you can kind of tailor the open time to what you need. If you get the fast cure hardener, that one's gonna give you about an hour of open time. If you get the extra slow, you can stretch it out to almost 4 hours. Now I'm gonna point out that the open time and the pot life are two different things. The pot life is when you mix it up in a cup. Because you have a large mass of epoxy inside this cup, it is gonna heat up a little bit quicker, and that's gonna cause it to cure a little bit faster. So as you mix it up and you start to spread it out, that spread out epoxy surface has the slower cure time. The pot life is in the mixing container. The cure time is what you have spread out on your parts. So if I have a big complex glue up, depending on how long I think I need, I will use something like the fast hardener. If I need a couple of hours to get it together, which is a long time, I'll use the extra slow hardener. So the next time that I will use epoxy in my shop is if I need something with gap filling abilities. Now, a standard PVA glue will fill a gap, but it's not true gap filling. What I mean by that is that gap that the glue may be stretched in between has no strength. So it doesn't actually do anything as far as adding integrity to the joint. Whereas epoxy is a true gap filling adhesive. So when you apply adhesive, let's say on a tenon that has a mortise that's a little bit loose, the epoxy will make up that air space within that joint, and it will give you a joint that is as strong or stronger than the wood itself. Whereas a standard PVA glue with a loose joint, you don't have that strength there. You're relying on what little surface area you have because the glue that's stretched in between the two joints isn't adding any extra strength there. You know, apart from filling gaps in joints, you also have the ability with epoxy to add something like the 407 low density filler. And this turns the epoxy from what I would consider an adhesive to more of a, I don't want to call it a paste, even though you can mix it up that thick, but it becomes has a little bit more body to it. So you can actually use it to build out repairs. If you have a corner of a table that's damaged and you want to build that out, you can use something like the low density filler to really bump up the viscosity of that epoxy, and that will help fill even bigger gaps. Now there is another type that you can use, which is these guys here, the G-Flex, and this is a pre-thickened epoxy that's much more like a paste. So you do have the ability to fill joints, build up material that you can then reshape a little bit, which is really nice. Now another time I'll use epoxy in my shop is when I have to bond stuff that's not necessarily wood. Our PVA glue is great at bonding wood fiber to wood fiber for the most part. There are some oily woods that don't bond real well, but for most things, PVA glue works really well wood to wood. But when I need to bond stuff that's not wood to wood, like hardware or metal, threaded rod, glass, fiberglass, stuff like that, that's where epoxy really shines. Epoxy can really bond those unlike materials together and give you a great bond. So something like installing threaded rod into a hole for shop-built tools, that's a great time to use epoxy and apply that in there. Now, the other thing about epoxy is it's not flexible. And while that might sound like it's not something you want a glue that's flexible, there are applications in the shop that you want something that has a nice rigid glue line. Doing something like bent lamination, for example. If you're gluing up a rocker for a chair, you get spring back a lot of times if you're using a PVA glue. It's because that glue is flexible, so it doesn't add any rigidity to that glue up. But by using epoxy, that is a rigid glue line. It helps reduce a lot of spring back, which is really nice, helps you hold your shapes a little bit easier. Now on that note, epoxy is a highly water resistant adhesive as well. I wouldn't say it's waterproof, but it's definitely water resistant. So there are other applications in the shop where I might be working on an outdoor project that I like to use epoxy as pads of feet on, let's say, an outdoor table. I use a little bit of a blue taper for barrier around the bottom of the leg and then pour epoxy on the end, and that seals up the end grain and makes just a little bit of a epoxy shoe to keep water from wicking up into that leg. So there are some really good applications for outdoor projects as well. Now, I want to leave you with a few final tips on using epoxy, or some things that you might not think about. One of my favorite things to do with epoxy is to use it to fill voids, as I mentioned, but in like an inlay type of setting. So I might mix in a little bit of mica powder to add color and use that to fill a crack in, let's say, a turning or something like that. It works really well, it fills gaps, and it adds some structure there. Now, mixing up epoxy doesn't have to be super crazy. That's one thing that a lot of people get worried about is, did I mix it right? Did I mix the right amounts? Stuff like that, because if you don't mix the right amounts, it might not get a full cure and it might stay sticky, or you're not reaching its maximum strength potential. So what I like to do when I buy the West System stuff, I also purchase their metering pumps, and these are nice because they are pre-measured. So these metering pumps are nice because one pump is one pump. So if I'm mixing up epoxy, one pump of resin and one pump of hardener, the different pumps measure it out correctly for the appropriate amount that I'm mixing up. So that kind of takes a lot of that guesswork out of the mixing it up. Now, I do like to mix up the epoxy in little plastic cups, or if I'm doing a little bit bigger amount, I'll use a red Solo cup. But as I mentioned before, keep in mind that the pot life is what you're concerned about in these cups. So as soon as you start mixing it up, you have the pot life to worry about. And if you do end up with extra epoxy left over, don't leave it in the cup, because I said this is an exothermic reaction. We do want to spread this out, because if you leave it in the cup, as it heats up and cures, it can melt the cup. And there's nothing worse than coming into the shop the next morning after you've used epoxy the day before and finding a melted cup of epoxy all over your bench. Ask me how I know that. So what I like to do is anything that's left over, I like to just spread that out over a scrap of cardboard, something like that, and let that cure flat. It avoids a lot of that exothermic reaction. It doesn't get hot enough that I don't think it's gonna light anything on fire, but it will melt cups and kind of make a mess. Now let's talk about cleanup real quick, because with standard PVA glue that's water soluble, you can just scrape it off and clean it up with water. With epoxy, it's a little bit different. I do like to scrape up anything that's left over and use a white paper towel to clean that up, but I also like to wipe down any excess squeeze out with acetone. Acetone is a great solvent to help clean up epoxy, and it avoids a lot of that shadowing that you can get from epoxy soaking into the wood fibers. Now that's an interesting point, that epoxy will soak into wood fibers. So another great application is to use epoxy to fortify punky wood. So a lot of times I like to turn stuff that's spalted. Has really nice color, really great figure, but it can get a little soft. So if I have any of those soft fibers that don't want to cut and they just want to mash, I can mix up a really nice thin layer of epoxy, spread that over and let it soak in, and it will fortify those fibers and make it a little bit easier to work. So I hope this video helps answer any questions that you might have had about epoxy, and gives you a little bit of insight on why epoxy is good to have in your shop and why it makes a great companion to your standard wood glues.